David was also acquainted with Dr. W. Edwards Deming from 1980 when they first met in Tokyo. And he has met and dined on many occasions with Dr. Armand Feigenbaum, as you know, the founder of the concept of total quality management. David himself is the author of several books on quality, quality circles, Hoshin Kanri, and just-in-time manufacturing. And David also has a chapter in Dr. Juran's book, A History of Managing for Quality. David's most recent book was written in 2019 and is called Quality Without Borders. And I encourage you to take a look at that book, very important in today's age, Quality Without Borders. So David, I'm going to stop talking now and I'm just going to present this first question to you, David.
Okay. Can I just say?
Yes.
I did originally call it Quality Without Borders, and it might be on what you've been reading there, but it is actually Quality Beyond Borders.
Thank you. Very good.
Sorry. Okay.
No, sorry about that. Sorry about that.
No, it's probably my fault.
No. So I hope we can all see David on full screen now. And just to get us started, David, could you tell us some of the lessons about quality that you learned from some of these great gurus? And perhaps you'd like to start with Dr. Joseph Juran and perhaps say where you first met him and what are some of the main lessons that he gave for society, that society can learn today. Thank you, David.
Okay. Do you mind if I come to that via Professor Ishikawa and a little bit of my history running up to that, because it actually fits together better if I do.
Absolutely.
And I will work on sharing screen with my fingers crossed. That looks like it's the right one.
All right, then.
Yeah.
Right, this is where I really wanted to be. Have you got that on full screen?
See it? Yeah, full screen.
Yeah.
Brilliant. Okay, that slide will become relevant later on, I expect. And let me see if this is doing, oh, good. Yeah, I'm a bit long in the tooth now, been around the block a few times. And my story actually begins in the early 1960s. I'm not going to take you on a blow-by-blow account, so you don't have to worry about that. But I was a production engineer in a company where we made pistons, piston rings, gudgeon pins for the automotive industry. And the fact that it was the early 60s is relevant because at that time and prior to that, Japanese products were seen as, Americans used to irreverently call them Jap crap, and they were known as cheap imitations of Western products. And no one at that time ever thought that the Japanese could become competitive in the way that they did. But during the 1960s, because I was in the automotive industry, we watched our market share decrease. We saw companies like Honda, Nissan, it was called Datsun in those days, Kawasaki just blasted our motorcycle industry out, as did Honda, the pair of them together. And that was happening all the way through the 60s. And virtually nobody responded to that. They still thought Jap crap and, oh, they eat a bowl of rice a day, and because of that, they don't have to pay them any wages, therefore they can undercut prices and so forth. But I wasn't sure that that was how it was. And we still felt that we ruled the world. We had over 50% of the global market in shipbuilding, similar statistics for motorcycles. But by the end of that decade, our shipbuilding industry was crippled and replaced by Japan as #1. TVs were still okay, but they were gone by 1975. And the automobile industry was in deep trouble. And my question was, how do they do that? And it was one day in 1968 when in the piston ring factory, we actually managed to obtain a set of 4 pistons manufactured by Honda from a local motorcycle shop. And we checked them in our laboratory, and I couldn't believe what we saw when I looked at the grain structure in our lab. And it was better even than the photographs on the relevant British standard. And my question again was, how do they do that? Unfortunately, there was nothing about Japanese manufacture written in English in those days, or at least not that was currently available, and I wasn't able to find it. Now, at that time, how I got into where I am now, one of my best friends in the company was the chief inspector. And you didn't have quality management in the 60s. There were 1 or 2 companies used that label, but generally speaking, people had inspection departments and a chief inspector. And the chief inspector's job was to try and stop rubbish from going out of the door, but he didn't have much to do with stopping it being made in the first place. That was my job as production engineer. So if the rubbish got out of the door, then he got the rap because he didn't stop it, and I got the rap for making it in the first place. So my job right from those days was quality improvement, although that isn't what people called it at that time. And what was beginning to happen I've got too much clutter on this screen at the moment. Hang on a minute, let me just move some stuff around. Yeah, in the 1950s, West and Japan had a common approach to quality because after the war, it grew out of the Americans during the 5-6 years after the war. They took out the existing Japanese system and tried to replace it with the American flow line mass production system. In the West, inspection developed from military procurement. The military in this country was responsible for something like 10% of all manufactured products. So they were one of the most powerful buying agencies in the country. And they didn't care how you manufactured products. All they wanted to make sure was that your rubbish didn't reach them. And so in those early days, they had what was called an approved firm system of inspection. That ran right through to 74. And that then developed into the defense standards, which then developed into ISO 9000, which I guess most of you are familiar with. But it has its roots in inspection. In Japan, their roots came from production engineering, which was actually my base, because as I said, they were unable to export due to poor quality. And also during the 1950s, the American system wasn't really working for them, and they objected to being treated like robots. And at the end of that time, and this is why I wanted to start somewhere different, Professor Ishikawa postulated that the Japanese system, the American system wasn't relevant to their culture and they had to change it. But he acknowledged that the flow line production system was far more competitive than the previous craft-based system. So he said, somehow or other, we've got to merge a team-based approach with flow line production that we've learned from the Americans. And I'll come back to that one later. I'm not in the sequence I thought I was in. Just bear with me for a second. No, I've gone. I've got to keep going back. Sorry, I've either taken it out or left a slide out. It doesn't matter, but I think I did. Getting a preview of what I was planning to say in a minute. Yeah, oh, here we are. I jumped over it. Oh, no, I didn't. I read the bottom bit. I didn't read what I put here. So in the early 1960s, total quality control emerged in Japan, and the label, as John mentioned at the beginning, was coined by the American Armand Feigenbaum. And Feigenbaum wrote a book entitled Total Quality Control. And he said that quality is everybody's job, which I don't think anyone would argue with. And he said that because quality is everybody's job, it becomes nobody's job. And therefore, it would be sensible to actually have a department that was responsible for making sure that quality happened. And it was originally intended by Feigenbaum that it was a supportive role and not one that was responsible for. Unfortunately, once Western companies started to take that advice, as soon as people saw a quality department, their mentality was such that they thought, well, if there's a quality problem, we'll blame the quality department. And so the quality department in Western eyes seemed to be responsible for quality. If anything went wrong, they got the blame. But then conversely, if the quality department found things that were wrong, they started blaming people. So it became, in the West, typically a police force type activity. In Japan, they took the same words that Feigenbaum said, but interpreted them differently. And instead of saying there should be a department that did this, Ishikawa suggested that everybody from the president downwards had to be intensively trained in the quality sciences and disciplines. And from those late 1950s, in Japan, if you look at education courses in universities right through the country, and from JUSE, the Japanese Union Scientists and Engineers, which is their main organization that supports quality, and look at the content of the courses for different levels of people, the chief executive has more hours a year on quality education and training than anybody else in the organization by a wide margin. And that's how it's been ever since. And in Japan, they don't actually have quality departments as such, which is a surprise to Westerners, because it's actually managed through the line process. And the person, if you want to know what a company's policy is on quality, the best person to ask is the managing director, because he'll know it better than anybody. It'll be his system, and it'll be the system that he's making sure happens. So there's a striking difference. And so I then ran this conference in London, and as John said, Ishikawa was it was his first and only visit to the UK, and that was in September 1979. Later on in 1983, how I got to know Dr. Juran was straight out of the blue, and I was working up in Manchester, funnily enough, and I got a call from my office, and my office weren't into quality as such, they just managed me, and they said, oh, we had a letter today from Dr. Juran. Well, Juran was and still is the #1 guru in the US in quality, and I couldn't believe I got a letter from him, and I was rather cagey about listening. I thought it was going to be full of criticism, and he invited me to meet him in London, and he asked me if I would represent him in the UK. And I couldn't understand why he should choose me. I wasn't the only person involved in quality in those days. And he said, you're the only one who's totally independent. The others all work for somebody else or do something that's got some other connections and so forth. And so I very gratefully took that on and pitched myself. And so I represented him right the way through to 1992. And I'll give you some talk in a moment about Juran's main contribution.
Thank you.
I'll come back to that. Right, where do we go from here?
David, if you'd like to explain what the culture was at that time that would not listen to the teachings that were coming out of Japan, the teachings that were coming out of America, and were you finding it difficult to get the British, for example, the British industry leaders and politicians to listen to you?
Well, it was quite interesting because I came out of industry in '69, and so it's 50 years ago now. and well, it was 50 years last year. And I went into education mainly because I was teaching a quality class on a Friday evening, because nobody in the college wanted to teach on Friday evenings. So they invited me to run a class, and I found I was looking forward all week to my evening class, and I decided that this is where I wanted to be. So I came out of industry and did that. And because I then took over responsibility for quality in the college, and the Chartered Quality Institute had just developed or created its own diploma in quality. And our college was in the process of setting up to run the courses. And I thought that if I was going to be responsible for that, I ought to get more acquainted with the Institute. So first of all, I joined it, and in no time at all, I was on its education committee. And also I became the secretary of the Southwest London branch. And as luck would have it, when I was in that early 1970s role, the CQI, or Institute of Engineering Inspection, as it was in those days, had invited a Dr. Kano to come to the UK to run a lecture tour. And this was the first time I'd had the opportunity to speak to a Japanese professor. Unfortunately, he spoke very good English. And I said to him that I really was curious about their management system, how they ran it. And he happened to be a friend of Professor Ishikawa's, and that's how I made that connection. Ishikawa then sent me that book that you just saw, a little booklet on there just now. He sent me that. And when I saw that sentence that's on there, our approach to quality is based on the idea each person's the expert in his or her own job, I just had a flash in my mind as to, wow, just think if we were able to do that. Now, as secretary of the Southwest London branch, we had our meetings in the office of Lord Percy Alloway, who was the Director General of the Defence Quality Assurance Procurement Board, and his assistant was our chairman of our branch, and they were very much involved in the development of the defence standards. And so I was watching the defence standards, and they were run by Admiral Spickenal. And Spickenal was a very ambitious man, personally as well as for the MOD. And there were already some standards called the Allied Quality Assurance Publications. And he didn't want to use them as they were because he wanted to get some credit for it. And so he changed some of the wording in there and called them defence standards. So they would AQAT 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and 9. There wasn't an 8. And he changed it to 0520, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and 9, and published those. And they came into operation in 1974. But now we've got what was happening in Japan, which was completely independent of that, and the stuff that I wanted to be doing. But the MOD, being so powerful, pushed the defence standards into industry. And they had an interesting policy because they had something like 16,000 people that went through sheep dip training and auditing in those early years. And they were, the MOD would not accept an audit that was carried out by anybody other than themselves. Mm. So if they had a principal supplier, they would always audit that principal supplier, and then they would allow those principal suppliers to then audit their sub-suppliers, but they couldn't accept the audit results of any other principal supplier if they had a common sub-supplier. Yeah. So even though one of these suppliers had audited somebody underneath, the other company had to do it as well. And this became, towards the end of the 70s, this became the problem of multiple assessment. And I knew the quality manager at Yorkshire Metals, and he told me that in the first 6 months of that year, they'd been audited by over 80 audit teams, because plumbing parts and things like that turn up in all kinds of products, and every single one of them had to audit them, despite the fact they've been audited that many times. And so the government then set up a report under somebody called Frederick Warner, and the Warner report suggested there ought to be an organisation that did it on behalf of everyone. That was a nice idea, but Spickenall absolutely refused that any supplier to MOD had to be audited by an MOD supply chain. But Spickenall took retirement and got an appointment with British Standard, and surprise, surprise, it suddenly became okay for British Standards to do it.
Yeah.
So they renumbered it from 0521 to 29 and called it BS 5750. But it was in the same part 1, part 2, part 3 structure. That ran right the way through to 88. And then it adapted itself and then became the ISO 9000, which was launched then, but it was still based on the same structure. And it was almost word for word up until then. But he managed, because he was so powerful with BSI, managed to persuade the British government to support this, irrespective of what people like I and others were trying to do to develop what Ishikawa had suggested. And so we were pushed into the long grass to a large extent. And they persuaded the government to set up a scheme in 1982, run by PIRA in Mount Mowbray. And they gave them £25 million, which was a lot of money in those days, to pretty well blast ISO 9000 or BS 5750 as it was then through industry. And so anything to do with total quality, quality circles and the like was just pushed to one side. They were not the flavour of the month in terms of this government pressure and support.
Yeah. So
actually, I'll just tell you an interesting thing. In 1982, because I was protesting loudly about this, I got invited to Westminster, to Victoria Street, to make a presentation on my perception of why they were wrong. And I had a lot of leading civil servants in the room, and at lunchtime they took me out to lunch.
Yes.
I realised very early on that there was a lot of wine on the table and a lot more than they were likely to drink, and I realised they were trying to get me tipsy. And I was pretending to drink it and not drink it.
Yeah.
And I can
felt a bit threatened by you, David. They felt a bit threatened.
Yeah, and they were hoping to compromise me. Yeah. And I said, look, I don't work for anybody. I only work for myself. And I am not going to be compromised, and I will say what I believe. And unless you can convince me I'm wrong, I'm going to carry on saying it. And I have. But that was where the dichotomy was. But interestingly, though, John, between after about 2000, the ISO community has recognized that total quality's actually got a lot going for it. And if you look at the way the standard has shifted through the last couple of decades, it's actually moved a long, long way towards, but it cannot replicate total quality. It's actually physically impossible because it's a standard. And you can't standardize on best practice because it ceases to be best practice then, because if it's something everybody's doing, then someone can find something to do that's even better.
Yes.
So it's always got to have that ingredient in there that takes it ahead of the pack.
And aren't we going to need that more than ever as we come out of this COVID-19 crisis, David?
You're so right. You're so right. And that leads me to back to total quality, which I'm using the term total quality, but actually total quality exists underneath an umbrella called Hoshin Kanri. And Hoshin Kanri is a term that doesn't fit very well with a lot of people in the West. Mainly it's very Japanese. And also, unfortunately, it doesn't actually translate directly into English.
So we tend to call it policy deployment or strategic deployment, David, is that right?
Well, it's got three elements to it. It's policy development. And the first stage of it is to, first of all, you have a vision where do we want to be? How do I see my company in the future?
Yes.
You know, if I'm a little coffee shop on the corner,
Yes.
do I have a vision of seeing my coffee shop just nicely filling up with people and paying for my summer holidays? Or do I have a vision of being a Starbucks?
Yeah.
So it's my coffee shop and it's my choice, but I have a vision of what I want it to be.
Yeah.
I then compare where it is with where I want it to be, and there's probably a gap. And so I've got my vision at the top. I've then got to decide, what structure do I need to have in place in order to start moving towards closing that gap?
Yeah.
And that is the strategic development. But once I've done that, I've got all the people that work for me. I've got to now take it down through my hierarchy. So I've got the strategic development, then I've got the deployment. But as I deploy it level by level, I need to know how it's going on at those levels.
Yeah. Yep. Oh, a little bit of a freeze there. Can people hear me okay?
Yeah.
Okay. David, I think might have frozen. And I was going to actually just bump in there and suggest that we've got a few points now.
Then
Yeah.
each year, I will want to know how well it's doing.
Yeah. We lost you for a minute there, David. Sorry.
Oh, I thought
we
you
lost
went-
that end part of Hoshin Kanri.
Yeah, I've got a thing that says internet connection is unstable.
Yeah. I would like to take that opportunity, actually, David, if you don't mind. We've got some nice big concepts on the table. The biggest one of them is this strategic planning, strategic deployment, policy planning. And companies are going to have to rethink their strategy, rethink their policy coming out of, as a result of COVID-19. And I think this is going to be a huge turning point. And companies that do not readdress their current strategy will be failing. They need to rethink their strategy and redevelop and innovate and adapt.
They'll be crushed underfoot by those who do if they don't.
Right. And I'd like to open that up. I'd actually like to open it up to the audience that point, but as well, anybody that's got any particular questions about David's meetings with Joseph Juran, work with Joseph Juran, Professor Ishikawa, any of those points. Now, I'm not sure we have a hand-raising method electronically with this method, but if you'd like to put up your hand physically, and I'll be able to choose somebody. If you've got a question, if you could just raise your hand, please.
Okay.
Hello, Brian. I see Brian Butler.
Yeah. Very brief this. I won't do it like they do on this briefing they have on the TV every day. David, one thing that I'm from the automotive sector originally, so a little bit like you. I'm a vehicle mechanic by trade. One thing that I used to hear people say, is this a myth, or in your experience was it true, that we used to procure things back in the 60s, 70s from the Japanese suppliers, and we put in, an allowance for so many percentage defects. And their mindset would be, oh, you've ordered 100 with a contingency of 2%, so we'll give you 98 good ones and 2 bad ones. Is that just sort of folklore myth, or was it happening?
I heard that story back in its early days, and I suspect it's a myth.
Yeah, I thought so, but I like saying it.
It's probably a myth, but I think the Japanese would have been confused as to why you wanted 2 bad ones, and it could have happened. It easily could have happened.
Yeah, appreciate that. Thanks.
Okay. So can I give you an anecdote with that?
Yeah,
in the early 80s, I used to, not only did I organize industrial study visits to Japan, but this was before Japanese had plants over here in the UK, and I was taking teams of Japanese managers to British companies to get a feel for British business culture. And on this particular visit, we went to Wedgwood in Barlaston, in Staffordshire. And this was I think this was one of the first one of these visits. And they actually had the Midlands TV were there as well and interviewing them and so on. It was quite a big splash. And Wedgwood had done a lot of work in preparing for it and repainting the white lines around and everything like this. They could not believe it, because as soon as the Japanese got in there, they just made a beeline for all the scrap bins. Oh, why is this? What happened here? They weren't interested in the normal production. They're only interested in why so many things went wrong, why there was this big heap of broken china out the back of the factory.
That's great.
Yeah, well, thank you.
Any more?
Any more questions?
Chris?
Have I got it, Chris?
You're unmuted, Chris.
I'm unmuted now. Thank you. Thank you, David. I read a little bit your profile on your website and read the words about the presentation by Dr. Ishikawa being epoch-making to the Institute of Directors.
Yes.
The directors in companies will have listened to so many people talking about quality in those days and now currently. So it's not the content of the message, it's how that's delivered that really makes a difference. You say it was an epoch-making event. What do you think it was about how Dr. Ishikawa delivered his message that made the difference and cut through and reached the audience?
Well, it was a mixture of things, Chris. Prior to the conference, I was approached by a guy named Jim Rooney from Rolls-Royce at Derby, and he had picked up some of the early publicity related to bringing Ishikawa over, and he said, we at Rolls-Royce are already doing it. And he invited me there, and at the time I happened to be quite friendly with the head of the management page on the Financial Times. And I told him about it, Chris Lorenz. He's unfortunately been dead a few years now. But Chris Lorenz sent a reporter up with me, a guy named Jason Crisp. And we went to Derby and Jim Rooney took us round. And he was experimenting, or you had what he called quality circles in there. If you want to be pedantic and detailed, they weren't precisely quality circles, but they were much the same sort of thing. They were groups of people from different departments rather than the same department, but nevertheless, they'd imported the basic problem-solving tools and they were using them and it was working. And I invited him to speak at our conference. And I put on a 3-day conference. That was a 3-day conference at the Institute of Directors. And I've still got all the audio tape. We recorded the whole thing. I've still got all of it. Ishikawa did virtually the whole of day one, spoke for most of day one, and chaired all 3 days, co-chaired the 3 days. We mixed the chairing with him, with other people. But we also had 1 or 2 other quite well-known Brits speaking, including the Minister of Trade, who spoke at it. And we had about 300 people there. And they were people like directors from Marks and Spencer's and various other companies. There were people, right at the event, Leyland turned up with a film called The Circle. And the guy that brought it said, we've got quality circles in Leyland. And would you show my video? And he was quite insistent about it, so I found time to show it. As it happens, I wished I hadn't, because it was completely off the wall and it violated about 90% of anything that Ishikawa was talking about. But nevertheless, we got 300 there, World Service Radio came, and afterwards, now up until then, I was employed by the college. The college didn't want to get into this stuff. I left the college and I went freelance, and that's how I've remained ever since. My wife nearly fell apart because we just got a big mortgage and so forth. But I was so confident this was the right thing to be doing.
No.
To be honest, we were running through, we were cutting through. I did a lot of training with about 50, 60 Marks and Spencer suppliers, and it was going really well. But this ISO, two things happened. One, the ISO thing was steamrollering. And the other thing that happened was that the government decided that it wanted to play with the stuff I'm doing, but I was persona non grata. They set up their own department that didn't even know how to spell most of this stuff a week before, let alone do it. And they made a complete and utter pixie of it. And then people said, we tried it once and it didn't work. And that was how it ended up at the back end of the 80s.
What was it about the particular way in which Ishikawa, shall we say, led that conference that cut through and reached the audience? I'm looking for his specific communication style and how he punched his message through.
Well, there are one or two things that you could pick out. One of them, and some of it's a little bit amusing, his English wasn't brilliant, and he suffered the usual problem that many Japanese people who haven't really mastered our language. He got L's and R's mixed up, and he kept on referring to flogs in the well, and people didn't know what he meant for a while until he drew it on a overhead projector slide, and it was frogs in the well. And he was actually likening our people to frogs that spent their life in a well. They thought that what was in the bottom of the well was how things are. And if you want to know how things are, you've got to get out of the well and look at the world.
Yes. Yes.
Very good. Thank you, Chris. I have a question from Stephen Murphy, I believe. Stephen.
Okay. I don't know if anybody's seen the recent article in Private Eye with respect to NHS procurement.
Oh, yeah.
And in the way that NHS procurement was reorganised to centralised procurement and all the rest of it, but not that article, to my mind, exemplifies how government misunderstands quality, in the sense that they crudely relate quality to cost saving. Personally, I'm not clear how far government has come along with the concept of reducing waste, as opposed and that having a direct result on saving money, as opposed to a crudely use of crude pressure saving money, cutting costs.
Yep.
Which ultimately results in
Yeah,
ultimately results in more waste. And the specific example I can give you is that my partner, her job is to go into wards, and sometimes she doesn't go into COVID wards, but goes into wards that are clear, but she's still protected. And when she puts her apron on, the aprons are actually so thin that in order to get one apron that works, you have to take multiple aprons off the roll. So it's clear somebody's had some brainwave whereby they can make the aprons cheaper, but the result is that more aprons get used. And it's just almost like a living example of how government and government procurement has totally failed to grasp quality. Which is why, to my mind, it is so poor at understanding how it drives and helps industry to support quality, because it doesn't know what it's doing itself.
Sorry, I've just got user against you. I don't know what your name.
My name's Steve. It's Steve Murphy.
Okay, Steve. Well, where do you think the government would learn it from? Where would they learn about quality? Where would they go if they wanted to learn about quality?
I think they would. I would ask them to go to one of the Japanese companies. I'd say go look at Toyota in Derby, and focus on what Toyota say, which is what we do is we make people who make cars. So think clearly about that. It's as much about the education and the development of skills in people as it, and then you have to take those basic ideas. You can't do a copy and paste. You have to look at the basic ideas and develop them in your organisation.
Oh man, am I pleased to hear you say that. That's very much my mantra these days. Because when you said go to Toyota, that I was mentally thinking a yes, but yes, go to Toyota, but also go to Nissan and Zippo Fasteners and Sony and whoever else is out there, and you'll find some things that are common to all of them. You'll find other things which are peculiar just to that one, or maybe some of them, but not all of them, because just like you said, they develop a way that works for them. And the best thing to do is not just to go to a Japanese company. You'll get some good stuff out of it, but you'll never get the whole picture. And really, you should go to Japan and study it in as many companies as you can afford to. And what you'll discover is what I just said. A lot of commonality, but also some peculiar things to them. I mean, everybody is obsessed with Toyota over here. And Toyota's good. There's no question about that. They push General Motors out of the way. And they're #1 in the world as such in motor car manufacture. But how about Komatsu? Komatsu, in 1980, Caterpillar had 96% of the world market in earth-moving vehicles. By 1985, they were down to less than 45%.
Komatsu means kill cat, doesn't it? It says that's what the company's named. Kill cat.
Komatsu, this is Hoshin Kanri. 1962, Komatsu made it their slogan, Encircle Caterpillar.
Yeah.
Now, at that time, that was like saying, telling a flea to encircle an elephant, because Komatsu was a small bit player in those days, even in their own local market. And Mitsubishi Heavy Industries was the big earth-moving vehicle manufacturer. But Japan was beginning to get a lot of stick from the West about unfair competition and everything like this. And Japan was protective, there's no question, but they opened up some windows, but they opened up selective windows where they thought it wasn't going to have a bad effect on their economy. And one of them was in heavy industry. And it enabled Caterpillar immediately to get into a relationship with Mitsubishi. And Komatsu thought the writing was on the wall because they would just be blasted out of the market. And they came out with this slogan, Encircle Caterpillar, which sounded ludicrous, but they'd done their homework. And what they did was that they really researched Caterpillar's policy. And Caterpillar's policy, seemingly sensibly, concentrated all their effort in the developed countries, because that's where the money is. So they focused on all the developed countries and so forth. They didn't bother at all with the underdeveloped and developing world. Komatsu saw that as an opportunity. So they developed a network through the whole of that world, and they invited people back to Komatsu. They set up banking arrangements and helped them fund and so forth, and took them into the company, taught them how to build the product, taught them how to do service and maintenance on them. And they did this all around the world. And then in 1980, like that, full frontal attack on Caterpillar from every direction, and Caterpillar just didn't know what hit them. And Ricoh did the same thing to rank Xerox at the same time. Because if you think back, if you're old enough to think back to the 70s, everybody in those days had a rank Xerox machine. And it was from one end of the office to the other. Most companies only owned one of them because it was so big. And you had a print lady. And she was like God Almighty, because if you wanted any copying done, you had to fill in a requisition form and take it to her. And depending on whether she liked you or not, you either got it done more or less immediately or had to wait about 3 or 4 days. And that's how it was in most companies. She was like she had the power of the Almighty. And Rico had studied all of that, saw it as Xerox's weakness, and instead of going for a full frontal like Caterpillar did, they just put one office in Edinburgh. And they took over because they got these nice little machines that just fitted into a corner somewhere, and you could have one in every department and so forth. Of course, people much preferred that to the big Xerox machines. Xerox was losing its market share in Edinburgh. Their salespeople in Edinburgh are tearing their hair out and going back to the company and saying, "Oh, these Rico people, they're outselling us." Well, it wasn't happening anywhere else, so Xerox ignored it. Then they set up another one in Bradford, and then another one somewhere else. After they got a number of strategically located bases, then they went for full page advertising in the newspapers, and they and Canon just pushed Xerox out of the market. And that's the sort of thing that was going on in those days.
They had a strategic plan.
Yeah. And
Yeah.
that's part of Hoshin Kanri.
Yeah.
You see, if you have a vision of where you want to be, and in Caterpillar's, in Komatsu's case, Encircle Caterpillar, that was their overarching, this was like their top end strategic aim. Everything underneath that and all the way down had to somehow or other fit back up into that. Now, it's not that we can't do it. When I started our coffee shop at the beginning of the epidemic, it wasn't very long after that they managed to build that first Nightingale hospital in London in 9 days. Do you remember when this crisis first started in China, and they built a hospital like that in that city, and they built it in 14 or 15 days? And everyone thought, well, it's the Chinese, we can't do anything like that, and so on. And yet we built one in 9 days, and now we've built all of the other ones. They're actually they don't realize it, but they're using the principles of Hoshin Kanri, where everybody working towards us being the best in our business, every single person. In that case, they did it because they got a common enemy, a common goal. No one disagreed with it. Everyone was dependent on everybody else, and they did it. What we're going to have to do, picking back up on what John said, after this is all over, we've got to make happen on purpose what in that case happened largely by luck. What are the lessons we can learn from the Nightingale?
Yeah,
you'll end up with Hoshin Kanri.
Yeah,
because that's what it was. Although they probably didn't even know how to spell Hoshin Kanri, but that's what they did. That was pure Hoshin.
David, that was great. Thank you, Stephen. We've got a few minutes left, and we have a few questions that have come in from Radu in Norway. Radu's asking about the Japanese approach versus the Western approach, and why 30 to 50 years has not changed the Western culture to a more integrated approach. That we still feel that it's a command and control culture, that the management police the companies. Do you feel that we haven't changed sufficiently in 30 to 50 years? Have I got that question right, Radu?
Yes. So basically, I see a lot, especially in my field, in oil and gas, that we have a quality department. It's totally different than the operations. They are not integrated. They actually don't know what is happening. So us in operations, we have to do the improvements. We have to take the lead. And it's very hard to actually act. And it's more like the quality departments are just there to comply to ISO. Basically,
we've got a mountain to climb, Radu. I was at a conference in Tokyo last year. This will give you an idea of the scale of the problem. I was at a conference. It was in Tokyo, They had 1,950 people there. It was a record attendance, and there were 35 countries represented, and countries like Bangladesh, India, Sri Lanka, all of those countries around there. You were getting like 20, 30 people from those countries going. I was the only person there from Europe, but there was nobody there from the whole of Russia, from east to west, nobody there from Scandinavia, not a single person, and only one American there from the whole of the North American continent. Mm. There were over 350 papers presented in 10 streams in that conference. A huge amount of information was changing hands, an enormous amount of learning. There was even industrial study tour tacked on the back of it if you wanted to go on it. And I was the only European there. If people don't go, if they don't attend these things, how are they going to find out? Now, if you go to any of our universities or management colleges and the like, and look at their prospectuses, their courses, their top management courses and whatever, what do you see in those courses on quality? Virtually nothing. And sometimes when I've seen the syllabus, all I've managed to find that's even remotely connected with quality is the word inspection. I might see ISO 9000. Do you know in that conference, quality conference, 350 papers, there wasn't one single paper on ISO 9000. Out of 350 papers on quality, not one on ISO 9000. It hardly got a mention anywhere. Because
David,
it's all around.
Fantastic. We are getting close to the end of the hour, and just to be fair to everybody, we don't want to overrun. We've got time for one more question. I've got one from Coden, and his question is, do you have a view on Tesla versus the German auto industry and where they both might be in 5 years from now?
I'm sorry, I haven't researched it.
No, okay, okay. Well, I would like to also mention that David does a meeting every morning, and I think it's from 9 a.m. until 10:30 a.m. Is that correct, David?
Yeah, it should be 10:15, but it usually ends up 10:30. Winston comes to it. Do you want to say a word, Winston?
Yeah, sorry. Yeah. From my perspective, I've been involved with lean. My background's automotive, 35 years. And I had a lot of areas of knowledge that I felt were lacking regarding the origins and really the integration of a lot of the tools and techniques associated with quality. And I've been with David now since the 3rd of April. I've learned more in the last few days than I would say in probably a period of 15, 20 years. And I say it for one simple reason. The thing that I thought was missing was this sense of people, the human relationship. And that's the bit I really understood from David, is what's at the heart of Hoshin Kanri. So that's what I wanted to share.
Thank you, Winston. And that is a free call that David will allow you to dial into. And where do we get that? I haven't got it available right now, but where do we get that meeting link, please?
I'll send you the link. It's actually, I hope it's the correct one, but if you've got an email from me, I've actually got it in my signature strip at the bottom.
Right, but people can get you on LinkedIn. Anybody watching this video after the fact, after it being live, they can find David Hutchins on LinkedIn and ask, or myself, John Dennis, on LinkedIn, and we will provide you that link to David's morning. He calls it the quality coffee shop, and people like Winston drop in and they discuss questions like we've been discussing today.
Okay.
So that is, if you have another question, I'm afraid we don't have any more time, but other questions can be asked of David in the morning. It starts at 9:30 UK London time.
9 o'clock.
9 o'clock, sorry. So 9 o'clock.
GMT +1, or British summertime.
Yes, yeah.
And I have to say British summertime, not BST, because I should have had some people there from Bangladesh last week, and at 9 o'clock about 7 o'clock in the morning, I was just getting up, and I got a call from Bangladesh. They said, I thought you were supposed to be on at 9 o'clock BST. I went back and I said, I am. And they meant Bangladesh Standard Time.
Well, that has been absolutely wonderful, David. Thank you so much for your time and sharing with us your insights, your knowledge, your inspiration to us, that you've been going at this and trying for so long to get these points across and have influenced so many people. I think I can say on behalf of all 17 people on the call, a big thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you much.
Thank you very much.
Thanks very much.
Thank all of you for giving me your time. I enjoyed it. I hope it was useful.
It was very useful.
Very much so.
Thank you, everyone, for being on, and we'll be in touch. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Namaste.
Namaste.
You don't have to shake hands with Namaste.
Namaste.